Alright, so I'm back and I'm ranking every 90s expansion team. And I'm ranking these teams based on the same way I did in my first expansion tier list video. So if you haven't watched the first video already, it's going to be in the description below. So I'll be going into the first 20 seasons of each team as I rank them based off of their regular season and playoff success, as well as the front office's ability to draft and acquire players, starting with the Minnesota Timberwolves. Basketball would return to Minnesota in 1989, last being played in 1960 as the Minneapolis Lakers would move to Los Angeles. The Timberwolves had a weak start, with the franchise winning less than 30 games in each of their first 6 seasons, as well as ranking bottom half in both offense and defensive rating, as the Timberwolves' only notable players were college phenom Christian Laettner, who the Timberwolves drafted 3rd overall in the 1992 draft, and a year later they would pick Isaiah Ryder, 5th overall, more known for winning the slam dunk contest in the 1994 All-Star Weekend, as well as Tom Gugliotta, who would be acquired by the Timberwolves in a trade for rookie Daniel Marshall, who was also drafted by the Timberwolves 4th overall in the 1994 draft. But after new owner Glenn Taylor would buy the team, later promoting NBA legend Kevin McHale as their GM, who was previously the assistant GM for the Wolves during the 94-95 season, McHale's first big decision would be in the 1995 NBA draft, where they would get a franchise-changing player in Kevin Garnett with their 5th overall pick. Garnett was one of the first high-profile players to declare for the draft from high school, and he would popularize coming out of high school as an option, as in the coming years, more and more players would declare for the draft from high school, including players like LeBron James, Tracy McGrady, Kobe Bryant, and many more. But in particular with Kevin Garnett, he would come into the league as a lanky, nearly 7-foot tall big man with amazing athleticism and mobility for his size, who can move and dribble like a wing. Though he was very tall for his position, he still weighed a lot less than his opponents, and due to his lack of strength to start his career, he would start to play small forward instead of his natural position at power forward. The Timberwolves' success in the 95-96 season would remain the same, having less than 30 wins in Kevin Garnett's rookie season, but previously having 5 coaches in 6 seasons. They made the necessary coaching change in hiring Flip Saunders mid-season, where before his arrival, Kevin Garnett was a bench player, but soon after joining, Saunders made the change to put Garnett in the starting lineup, giving him the necessary reps to become a better player, and this would help Garnett in the long run. With another disappointing season overall, the Timberwolves would end the 95-96 season with a 26-56 record, and they would pick 5th in the 1996 NBA draft. And the Timberwolves would draft Ray Allen out of Connecticut in the 1996 draft, later trading that same pick for Stephon Marbury, who was drafted earlier with the 4th overall pick. One of the reasons for this trade happening was the positional need that the Timberwolves had at point guard, as well as Ray Allen's position at shooting guard being taken up by Isaiah Ryder, who the season before was averaging 20 points a game. Another part of them making the trade, though, was the fact that Marbury and Kevin Garnett were childhood friends, and building team chemistry would be a lot easier. And this would be proven very quickly, as the Timberwolves would improve dramatically, increasing their win totals to 40 and making the playoffs in the 96-97 season. Garnett would improve during this time, becoming an all-star in that season, which would put him as one of the youngest all-stars ever, with Tom Gugliotta also getting an all-star nod as well for the first time. Stephon Marbury would also show out in his rookie year, as he would earn all-rookie first-team honors in one of the best draft classes to date, that featured Allen Iverson, Ray Allen, Kobe Bryant, Shareef Abdul-Rahim, and Antoine Walker, who all made the all-rookie first or second team that would end up being all-stars in their first 5 seasons of the NBA. Even though the Timberwolves would lose in a sweep to the 3rd seeded Houston Rockets, the Timberwolves showed a lot of promise in that series and showed that this could be a team that can contend in the future with Kevin Garnett and Stephon Marbury leading the way. The Timberwolves would waste no time in the 1997 offseason in signing Kevin Garnett to a 6-year, $126 million contract extension. Now the Timberwolves would continue to steadily improve through Kevin Garnett and Stephon Marbury, nearly making it out the first round against the Seattle Supersonics, losing 3-2. But the season to follow is where problems would really start for the franchises in the middle of the 99 lockout season, Contract extension talks would stall with Stephon Marbury and the Timberwolves, where they would end up trading Marbury to the New Jersey Nets for Terrell Brandon. The reason behind Marbury leaving and declining the extension was due to Kevin Garnett. Essentially, he wanted to be looked at as the star on the Timberwolves, and this was said by both Kevin Garnett and Tom Gugliotta at the time. And this makes a lot of sense looking at how players' mindsets were at the time, with most teams in the NBA only having one star on their team. But this move would leave Kevin Garnett as a lone all-star with former all-star Terrell Brandon, as Tom Gugliotta, who had his best years as a Timberwolf, would leave to go to the Suns earlier in that 98 offseason. Over the next handful of seasons for the Timberwolves, they would stay stagnant as they could not get out of the first round due to Kevin Garnett being again the only star on the team, as well as some problems on the front office side. As the Timberwolves from the 99 offseason to the 2001 offseason was set to sign Joe Smith for the minimum in an attempt to get his bird rights and for him to sign an even bigger contract by the end of that time for a 6-year, over $80 million contract. But the NBA found out, and this would seriously hurt the Timberwolves, as in the long run, Joe Smith would now become an unrestricted free agent in that 2000 offseason, losing all his bird rights. And one of the punishments the NBA would hand down for the Timberwolves is them forfeiting 4 of their next 5 first-round picks from 01 to 05. So now with Kevin Garnett taking up a good amount of the cap and having no draft capital, it was even harder for the Wolves to get any stars or capable role players in a Western Conference that got a lot stronger with teams like the Lakers and the Spurs at the top. By the end of the 03 season, this would mark the Timberwolves' 7th first-round exit for Garnett and the Wolves, and in the offseason, the front office would finally try and make a push to become contenders in the West. Most notably trading for starting point guard Sam Cassell, as well as Latrell Sprewell, who was a former All-Star as well as a great scorer for the Knicks before coming to Minnesota. And with an improved supporting cast, KG proved that he could be a top player on a winning team, improving the Timberwolves to the best regular season record so far in franchise history at 58-24 in the 04 season. Averaging a personal best in points and rebounds at 24 and 14 respectively, and the Timberwolves earning the best record in the West, KG would earn MVP honors for his production, and with an improved supporting cast of Sam Cassell and Latrell Sprewell, the Timberwolves had a chance to compete for a championship. These Timberwolves would win their first playoff series ever against the Denver Nuggets in 5 games in the first round. Then in the second round, they would beat the Sacramento Kings in a hard-fought 7-game series, where in Game 7, Kevin Garnett would have an amazing performance with 32 points, 21 rebounds, 5 block shots, and 4 steals, which was his best performance in the playoffs thus far and one of the best performances in playoff history overall. Though unfortunately they would lose in the conference finals to a super team in the Los Angeles Lakers. Sam Cassell would be injured, missing the final 2 games of that series, as well as backup point guard Troy Hudson, who would have a season-ending ankle surgery. So the Timberwolves had to rely on third-string point guard Derek Martin and extended minutes from players that should not have been playing the point guard position, and the Timberwolves would lose in 6 games. The Timberwolves had the best season in franchise history, going all out to help KG and the franchise get a ring, but this would be the beginning of the end for their playoff contention, as the very next season they would not make the playoff. This was due to contract disputes between the Timberwolves as well as some of their players, as to start that 2004 offseason, they would sign Troy Hudson as well as Trenton Hassel to multi-year deals before starters Sam Cassell and Latrell Sprewell. So with all the problems surrounding the team, with players disgruntled as well as there still being minutes to go around throughout the rotation, the Timberwolves would slide to 500 in their first 50 games, going 25-25, and with the owner Glenn Taylor forcing Kevin McHale's hand to fix the problem, head coach Flip Saunders was the first to go. The Timberwolves would continue to move away from their 2004 core, with Latrell Sprewell in the 05 offseason leaving and ultimately retiring, as well as Sam Cassell being traded to the Los Angeles Clippers. For the Timberwolves, for the next 2 seasons after 2005, the Timberwolves would remain stagnant, only winning 33 and 32 games respectively in those 2 seasons, where Kevin Garnett was the only star with minimal support to really help him make a push in the crowded Western Conference. Fortunately for the Timberwolves, they would finally have their draft picks to use now, where they first in 06 would draft Brandon Roy, which would have been a great pick if they hadn't traded him for Randy Foye, who ended up being a career backup, and them drafting Corey Brewer in the 2007 NBA draft with the 7th pick. He would end up being a role player for the team as well. But none of these picks made a difference in the fact that KG was getting older and starting to get past his prime, and he wanted to contend for a championship. So with that, KG would eventually get traded in the 2007 offseason to the Boston Celtics, where in return, the Timberwolves would get 2 first-round picks and Al Jefferson, who was a young big man who showed a lot of promise as a Celtic in the prior season. After the KG trade, this would essentially be their move to bring the Wolves back to a rebuilding team, and this would continue going in that direction in the 2007-2008 season, trading the rest of their players with value to get more picks and gain aspiring contracts to free up cap space. The Timberwolves would end up going 22-60 in the 2008 season and obtaining the 3rd overall pick in the 2008 NBA draft, later drafting OJ Mayo out of USC. But OJ Mayo would later be traded that night in a multiplayer deal for Kevin Love, who was drafted 5th overall. But the only thing Timberwolves fans would look forward to from this moment onwards would be the NBA draft, as they wouldn't win more than 25 games in their next 2 seasons, leading to lottery picks in the next 2 drafts. Specifically in the 2009 NBA draft, due to the trades that they were able to pull off a season ago, they were able to accumulate a boatload of draft picks, including 4 first-round picks in 2009, which included 2 top 10 picks in the 5th and 6th pick, as well as the 18th and 28th. They would famously pick 3 point guards with their first 3 picks, one of them being Ricky Rubio, who was still playing in Spain and didn't play for the Wolves for the first few years. With their second pick, they would select Johnny Flynn out of Syracuse, but looking at it in hindsight, the Warriors with their next pick at 7 would pick Stephen Curry, and this would change the league for the Warriors and the NBA in general. But though it was a missed opportunity for Minnesota, I won't give them too much flack because we didn't know what Stephen Curry would be coming out of that draft. Overall, the Timberwolves would have 8 playoff appearances, 7 of which was first-round exits, and 1 where they would actually be finals contenders, only losing in the conference finals under KG as their franchise player. And with the NBA limiting the Timberwolves in the early 2000s to build a championship contender around KG, this caused only a 1-year window where KG and the Timberwolves could have won a championship in 04. So basically, before KG got drafted as well as after the 04 season, the Timberwolves were either not making the playoffs or was a bottom-feeding team with only okay draft choices after KG left. So overall, I'm going to have to give the Timberwolves a D. Now the other team that we're going to talk about in that same 89 expansion draft is the Orlando Magic. The creation of the franchise will come from Orlando businessman Jim L. Hewitt and Philadelphia 76ers general manager Pat Williams, who would invest in the group and pitch the franchise to then Commissioner David Stern in 1985, and later being approved by the NBA in 1987. After the expansion draft, in the first 3 seasons, they would struggle as the Orlando Magic would rank bottom 10 in both offense and defensive rating, and with only small improvements over the years by their first 2 first-round picks in Nick Anderson and Dennis Scott, who were the only bright spot for the Magic at that time. But with one of the worst records in the league, the Magic would enter the lottery in 1992 and end up with the first pick in the draft, and there was really one player a tier above everybody else, and that would be Shaquille O'Neal. The 7'1", nearly 300-pound phenom coming out of LSU was a spectacle to behold, as no one's seen a player of that size move and dominate the way he did since Wilt Chamberlain, and based off of his size, it looked like it was going to be an easy transition to the NBA. And Shaq showed his dominance early, averaging 23 points, 14 rebounds, and 3.5 blocks, good for finishing top 5 in blocks and 2nd in rebounding in the NBA and winning Rookie of the Year. As in his first season, it was clear to see Shaquille O'Neal would be a superstar for years to come, but the season would end with them winning half of their games, ending the season 41-41 and barely missing the playoffs. Even though the Magic barely missed the playoffs, them being in the lottery again meant they were projected to have the 11th overall pick, though they would make a leap as their luck would bring them another first overall pick in the 93 draft. All eyes turned to Chris Webber as a projected number 1 overall pick, playing for the Michigan Wolverines and bringing them to 2 straight national title games. As this could have been the opportunity of maybe one of the greatest big man duos of all time, the Orlando Magic would instead go into another direction as they would draft Chris Webber first overall, but then trade Webber to the Golden State Warriors for point guard Penny Hardaway out of Memphis. At this point of the league, where big men have dominated throughout history, having 2 bigs, especially both of Shaquille O'Neal and Chris Webber's calibers and skill sets, would have complemented each other and the team very well. But the Magic going another direction was due to Shaquille O'Neal's influence on the front office before the draft, as Shaq would see Penny before the draft in the movie called Blue Chips that starred both players. And throughout the film, they had scrimmages where Shaq got to see the potential in Penny and himself as a duo. This would pay off as the Orlando Magic would improve to 50-32, improving their offense from 13th to 3rd in the league, as Penny Hardaway would thrive early as their starting point guard, making the all-rookie first team, and Shaq would continue improving alongside Penny, averaging 29 points per game. They would later lose in the first round of the 1994 playoffs, even though they had a higher seed, but it was clear to see that Orlando now has a dynamic duo in Shaq and Penny. And that would include the very next season where the Magic would finish 57-25, which would put them first in the conference as well as ranking them first in offensive rating. A fast-paced run and gun offense behind Penny Hardaway, efficient shooting from Dennis Scott and Nick Anderson, while still being effective in the half-court with Shaq controlling the paint, as well as the addition of Horace Grant, their starting power forward who earned all defensive second team that season. The Magic would go to the finals, highlighted by them beating a Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen-led Chicago Bulls team, defeating them 4-2 in the semifinals, leading to a final series against a team with another superstar big man in Hakeem Olajuwon and the Houston Rockets. The Magic going into the series was actually a favorite compared to the veteran Houston Rockets team, due to the Houston Rockets only finishing the season as a 6th seed. But the series would be summed up on a specific sequence in Game 1. Though Game 1 was exciting overall as it came down to the final seconds with Orlando having possession up by 3, all they needed to do was clinch the game with free throws, and it would be Nick Anderson to do so. The Rockets was forced to foul Nick Anderson, who was only a 70% free throw shooter, and then Nick Anderson proceeded to miss both free throws. Nick Anderson was fortunate enough to get the rebound and then immediately get fouled again, as at the moment it would seem like luck would be on the Orlando Magic side once again. But Nick Anderson would then miss the next 2 free throws, giving the Rockets the opportunity to tie the game, which was then done so by Kenny Smith as he hit a game-tying 3 to send the game into overtime, which the Magic would later lose. The Magic would end up losing the series in a sweep. Even though Shaq and Penny played great throughout that series, it was just that the Rockets were just way better, as Hakeem would lead the team averaging 33 points and 11 rebounds throughout the series, also with the help of Clyde Drexler, averaging nearly a double-double with 21 points, 9 rebounds, and 7 assists per game. In the 95-96 season, the Magic mostly stayed on the same page and entered the playoffs as a 2nd seed, and everything looked good, winning the first 2 rounds, only losing 1 game in that time. But on the other side of that conference final series was a true juggernaut in the Chicago Bulls. The Magic would have their own problems going into that series, as Horace Grant would be out for the series due to injury, and even playing in the series, role players Dennis Scott and Nick Anderson would play below average compared to the series before with the Bulls in 95. So with these factors, the Magic would lose in a sweep to the Chicago Bulls, and going into the 96 offseason, there would be a couple problems for the Magic. First, Shaq's contract was due, and it would be an easy thought to just re-sign him for whatever he wanted as the franchise player. But the worst possible outcome happened for the Magic, as first they would lowball Shaq, as well as Shaq having a mini beef with Penny Hardaway over who was the leader of the team, turned into a battle of ego. Shaq would end up leaving for the Los Angeles Lakers in the summer of '96, signing a $20 million contract with the team. Now for the next few seasons after 1996, this would start a Penny Hardaway-led roster, but without Shaq dominating in the middle and Penny Hardaway's declining play due to injuries, this would cause the Magic to be inconsistent over the years, as Hardaway would miss a total of 118 games in a 3-year span. And with only a couple of first-round exits, the Magic would end up making a change in the 1999 offseason and trade Penny Hardaway to the Phoenix Suns. After a 41-41 record in the 2000 season under new coach Doc Rivers, this would mark a new era for the Orlando Magic, as this is the first season where no players returned from that 1995 finals roster. And the Magic would make the biggest offseason moves of any team in an expansion series, with the Magic trading for superstar Grant Hill in the 2000 offseason, who at that point was a 5-time All-Star, coming off a season averaging 25 points, 6 rebounds, and 5 assists, also averaging a career high in 3-point percentage. The Magic would also sign 21-year-old Tracy McGrady, where he showed flashes throughout his career and was mostly known as a role player behind his teammate and cousin Vince Carter on the Toronto Raptors. The Magic would miss the chance at a true dynasty, as they were in advanced talks with Tim Duncan to join the Magic, but negotiations would fall apart according to Grant Hill, as Tim Duncan requested family members to be able to join him on the team playing for away games and road trips, but for some reason the Magic denied him. Even though Tim Duncan didn't join the Magic, they were in very good odds of being contenders behind Grant Hill as a star and a talented player like McGrady, and you'd see his potential early, as McGrady would increase his average of 15 points the season before to 26 points in his first season with the Magic, also adding 7 rebounds and nearly 5 assists a game to become a star in the NBA overnight. The only problem for the Magic was the unfortunate injuries, which caused a lengthy rehab for Grant Hill, as his ankle injuries would hold Grant to only 4 games in the 2000-2001 season. Ankle problems would only continue for the star, as in the 02 season he would only play 14 games, followed by a 29-game season in 03, as well as Hill sitting out the entire season, and this was very devastating for the Magic organization, because meanwhile in that time Tracy McGrady would put up an argument as the best scorer in the league, averaging highs of 32 points per game and winning the scoring title 2 years in a row, also making the All-Star team in every year with Orlando. Tracy could do only so much, as in the first 3 seasons with the Magic, he'd make the playoffs only to lose in the first round, where he'd be a lower seed and barely a championship contender without Grant Hill, as the team around Tracy wasn't good enough to sustain a long run in the playoffs without 2 stars. Even though understanding the situation with Grant Hill, he still grew frustrated, as after a 21-61 season in 04, where they would start 1-10 and fire head coach Doc Rivers, both McGrady and the management knew a change had to be made, and in the summer of 04, Tracy McGrady would be traded to the Houston Rockets for All-Star Steve Francis. In the 2004-2005 season, this rebuild that featured rookies Dwight Howard and Jameer Nelson, as well as Hedo Turkoglu, who was a role player at the time. This roster was also balanced out with veterans like a returning Grant Hill, who would become an All-Star that same season, as well as point guard Steve Francis, who I mentioned earlier in that McGrady trade. This gave the Magic the opportunity to stay competitive while Howard and Nelson were still getting adjusted to the NBA. Skipping ahead to the 06-07 season, Dwight Howard would have his breakout season, making his first All-Star appearance, averaging 17 points, 12 rebounds, and almost 2 blocks a game, while still being top 3 in field goal percentage. The Magic would make the playoffs for the first time since 03. Though they would lose to the Detroit Pistons in the first round, this was a good start for an up-and-coming team with a rising star in Dwight Howard. And coming to the 07-08 season, the Orlando Magic made significant changes to fit Dwight Howard's playing style, first in hiring head coach Stan Van Gundy, that recently had a history with a dominant center. And they would be able to officially build a scheme around Dwight to make the highly efficient Howard become better, with their first move in signing 3-point shooter Rashard Lewis to a 6-year contract for over $100 million. Where Rashad's reason for joining was seeing Dwight Howard as a future superstar, and this paired with Hedo Turkoglu averaging nearly 40% from 3, as well as Jameer Nelson improving his 3-point percentage to 41 over his career. The core helped space out the floor for Dwight to be even more of a threat in the post as well as in pick and rolls. The Magic would improve to 52 wins and get the 3rd seed in the 2008 playoffs, and Rashard Lewis' prediction would be true as Howard would earn all NBA first team honors, where he would officially become the best center in the league, improving his game all around and later advancing all the way to the 2nd round before losing to the Detroit Pistons for the 2nd straight season in a row, though the series was more competitive than the last. Now in the 08-09 season, the Magic would continue to improve from the previous season, with Dwight Howard averaging a career high in blocks and becoming the Defensive Player of the Year. This would put Orlando as the best defensive team in the league, ranking 1st in defensive rating and putting them in a good position in the East as playoff contenders. Though Orlando's playoff run was without their starting point guard Jameer Nelson for most of the playoffs, but they'll defeat the Sixers in a hard-fought series in the 1st round and then beat an injury-riddled Celtics team without KG in the semifinals, advancing to the conference finals, where they would face a finals favorite in the Cleveland Cavaliers behind LeBron James, where in that series he would average 38 points, 8 rebounds, and 8 assists, which were some of the craziest stats you'd see in a playoff series. Dwight Howard would step up in his biggest moment of his career, averaging 25 points, 13 rebounds, and shooting better than 60% from the field, essentially looking unstoppable. And even being known as a struggling free throw shooter, he would shoot up to 70% from free throws in that series. But it wasn't just Dwight, as this was a team effort because of their spacing due to Rashard Lewis, Hedo Turkoglu, and even other shooters stepping up like Rafer Austin and Mikal Pietrus. And the Orlando Magic would beat the Cleveland Cavaliers in 6 games to advance to their 2nd ever NBA Finals. And the Magic would enter the finals facing the Los Angeles Lakers, starring a determined Kobe Bryant that was coming off an MVP season and a finals loss last year. The Lakers were favored to win the series, and they would quickly show why, as they would win in Game 1 by 25 points, and the whole Magic squad would struggle throughout that game. The momentum of the series could have been changed in Game 2, where at the end of the 4th quarter, both teams were tied and rookie Courtney Lee had a chance to win the game off of a lob inbounds pass, but Lee would miss it and later lose in overtime. Though they would later win Game 3, but that wouldn't be enough, as the Lakers would take the next 2 games and Kobe would take over to win that series for the Lakers. And with Dwight Howard only being 23 years old at the time, the Magic were projected to be playoff contenders in the Eastern Conference for years to come. So overall, the Orlando Magic had a lot of talent throughout their first 20 years as a team, but I think the only problem was that none of these players got to their full potential yet. Shaq and Penny would only play 3 seasons before their prime, as well as Grant Hill and T-Mac never really getting the chance to play due to injury. The Magic would go to the finals twice in their 11 playoff appearances, and this is really good for an expansion team, and overall I would give the Magic an A for their expansion run. So now that we're done with the 1990 expansion teams, it's time to go up north to the Canadian expansion teams, first starting with the Vancouver Grizzlies. And it all started in 1993, where the NHL's Vancouver Canucks owner Arthur Griffiths would make a bid for an NBA expansion franchise in Vancouver. The team first hired Stu Jackson as a GM, who was at the time recently known as one of the youngest head coaches in history with the New York Knicks, and bringing them to a playoff appearance in that same season of 1990. The expansion draft for the Vancouver Grizzlies mostly featured role players and veteran players, and for their first NBA draft, they would select Bryant Big Country Reeves with the 7th overall pick. With researching all the expansion franchises' first seasons, there was always a couple of players with surprising seasons and career high seasons due to the team just lacking talent in general. But in this case with the Vancouver Grizzlies, no one stepped up, as in their inaugural season, the Grizzlies were one of the worst out of all the expansion teams, winning the first 2 games of the season and then losing 19 straight afterwards, and that still wouldn't be the worst streak, as they would later in the season lose 23 straight to have one of the worst losing streaks in NBA history, and finishing the season going 15-67. Now, over the next couple of seasons, the Grizzlies had a chance to improve their talent on the roster through the draft, but their potential to get star talent were limited due to some of the rules that were given to them from the NBA and mostly the owners from other NBA teams. First, the Grizzlies and the Raptors weren't allowed the number 1 overall pick in any of their first 3 seasons, and this would be in drafts that included Allen Iverson and Tim Duncan. So that made it much easier for the Grizzlies to lose out on a potential franchise player, but in 1996, they would draft the 3rd overall pick Shareef Abdul-Rahim, as well as drafting Antonio Daniels with the 4th in 1997. Abdul-Rahim and Reeves would continue to steadily improve, but their 1997 draft pick Antonio Daniels struggled and was later traded after his rookie season, and his replacement would come into the form of point guard Mike Bibby that the Grizzlies selected in the 1998 draft with the 2nd overall pick. And in the 99 lockout season, Bibby would have a decent rookie year, but the Grizzlies would continue to lose, winning less than 10 games in the lockout shortened season. But the worst was yet to come, as going in the 1999 NBA draft, the Grizzlies was set on selecting the projected number 2 pick Steve Francis, but the only problem was he didn't want to go to Vancouver. Francis, being a 6'3" guard, would have played minutes beside the same point guard the Grizzlies drafted a year ago in Mike Bibby, and Steve Francis wasn't excited at the idea of playing next to a point guard, essentially having the ball a lot less. That would probably mess with his play style, as well as him guarding shooting guards that were taller and bigger than him. But the Grizzlies still selected Francis with the 2nd overall pick, and his reaction to the pick really says it all, as he was not looking forward to playing for the team. So with Steve Francis not wanting to be a shooting guard nor a point guard off the bench behind Mike Bibby, he essentially wanted out, and he would later get that wish, being traded to the Rockets, with the Grizzlies getting little in return. The best player to come from that trade would be Michael Dickerson, where he would average decent numbers in his rookie season for the Rockets, then becoming the Grizzlies' 2nd leading scorer over the next 2 seasons. Though unfortunately Michael Dickerson's career would be shortened due to injuries after the 2001 season. And in those next 2 seasons, from 1999 to 2001, they would increase their win total, but not by a lot, being only in the low 20s. And with continuous losing came the dwindling attendance and a new owner coming in, and before the final season in Vancouver being at an expected loss of $50 million going forward, they would leave Vancouver after the 2001 season, marking a 6-year run that included the Grizzlies never winning over 25 games in a season. To really add insult to injury, once they did make the move to Memphis, in the 2001 draft, they would trade their best player in franchise history so far, Shareef Abdul-Rahim, for another big in the 3rd overall pick, Paul Gasol. They would also draft 3-and-D player Shane Battier out of Duke with the 6th overall pick, as well as trade Mike Bibby to the Sacramento Kings for Jason Williams, essentially making a brand new core. And the Grizzlies' first season in Memphis would stay the same, with them having the same record as their final season in Vancouver. Now going into the 02-03 season, the Grizzlies would make a change, specifically in the front office, acquiring NBA Hall of Famer Jerry West, who was becoming a legend as an executive off the court, as he was a part of the roster building of the Showtime Lakers, with West winning 3 championships in the 80s as an executive, as well as creating another Lakers dynasty in the early 2000s, with West being a key part in signing Shaq, as well as drafting Kobe Bryant in 1996. That would be a true turning point for Memphis, as in their 2nd season under Jerry West as the GM, the Grizzlies would make a complete turnaround, winning 50 games for the first time in franchise history. This was a big improvement from their previous 28-game win season. Jerry West made good roster changes, adding James Posey, who was an efficient scorer, as well as acquiring 3-point specialist Mike Miller, and the team continuing to improve with Gasol, Battier, and Jason Williams getting chemistry together on the court, as well as their overall defense and offense improving to 11th and 7th respectfully. With that, Hubie Brown, their head coach at the time, would become the NBA Coach of the Year in 2004, as well as Jerry West being awarded NBA Executive of the Year that same season. The Grizzlies would make the playoffs in 04 as a 6th seed, as they would later lose in a sweep to the San Antonio Spurs in the first round. This overall was a very good season for the Grizzlies, as they would make a monumental leap from what they've done before as a franchise. The Grizzlies' regular season record would stay consistent over the next 2 seasons, but the only problem with that was their playoff record was also consistent over those next 2 years, as the Grizzlies would get swept by the Phoenix Suns in 05 after barely making it into the playoffs to begin with, beating out the earlier mentioned Minnesota Timberwolves by 1 game in 05 for the last spot. Then in 06, they would face the Dallas Mavericks, in which Memphis was the 5th seed, but they would be a little bit unlucky in the sense that these teams were title contenders. A playoff conference appearance for the Phoenix Suns in 05, as well as the Dallas Mavericks making it to the finals in 06. These playoff series showed the type of competition the Grizzlies would have to go up against to really make a playoff run and be true contenders in the West. The Grizzlies made some roster changes over that time, with point guard Jason Williams and forward James Posey being traded to Miami for Eddie Jones, as well as them replacing Williams with Damon Stoudemire at point guard, who played well for them but only played 27 games due to injuries in 2006. The changes continued in the form of Shane Battier getting traded to the Rockets for Rudy Gay, who was recently drafted 8th in the 2006 draft, as well as acquiring Stromile Swift, where this would be his second stint as a Grizzly, being a former 2nd overall pick for the Grizzlies that they made in 2000. And if you're wondering why I haven't mentioned Swift before, since he's literally the highest draft pick in Grizzlies history so far, it's because I thought it would be better to explain his first stint just before his second. He was drafted as a power forward, and at the time the Vancouver Grizzlies already had Shareef Abdur-Rahim starting, so obviously Swift had to play off the bench, and throughout that time he would continue to be a bench player later once Gasol even joined the team. So once he entered the league and throughout his entire run with the Grizzlies, Swift was nothing more than a rotational player. Mind you, the year before in 1999, this was when they took Steve Francis. So the Grizzlies made the same mistake they did with Steve Francis, drafting without positional need. The Grizzlies would fall off a cliff, going 22-60 for the next 2 seasons from the 2007 and 2008 season, and winning 24 in 2009. In that time, they would draft point guard Mike Conley in the 2007 draft. They would also lose Jerry West before the 2007-2008 season to retirement, and with a big meltdown defensively, going from a top 5 defense to being last in the league, with the best defender Shane Battier getting traded earlier, like I mentioned, and with the direction of the team, the Grizzlies franchise player Paul Gasol wanted to change the scenery. Gasol would later get traded to the LA Lakers in a deal most famously for trading Kwame Brown and other assets, one of them being Paul Gasol's younger brother Mark, and 2 first-round picks, but at the time, people questioned if Gasol was worth everything the Lakers were giving up, which created this memorable moment from Stephen A. Smith.
Did LA give up too much to get a guy who has been labeled soft, although he puts up 19-9, which only 11 other guys do?
Is that a trick question?
You tell me.
They gave up Kwame Brown. Who
first
cares?
Rounders.
I could care less. Kwame Brown is gone. The City of Angels, Hollywood, just should be celebrated. Throw a parade already, whether you win a championship or not. This man was a bona fide scrub. He can't play. No disrespect whatsoever, but I'm sorry to tell everybody the truth. The man cannot play the game of basketball.
This started a short rebuild for the Grizzlies as the team had a new core of Rudy Gay, who was an athletic wing with 3-level scoring potential, Marc Gasol, who had the same basketball IQ as his brother offensively, but also had the potential to be a great interior defender, as well as Mike Conley, who had the opportunity to become a reliable point guard that you could trust to run your offense. And they'll continue to add to this core in 2008 and 2009, first drafting OJ Mayo with the 4th overall pick in the 2008 draft, and in the 2009 offseason, trading for Zach Randolph, who was a top-tier post scorer, completing the Grizzlies starting lineup, and quickly becoming an all-star in the first season he played with the Grizzlies in the 09-010 season. The Grizzlies made it back to the 40-win mark, later signing future all-defensive team player Tony Allen to guard the opposing team's best player, as well as bring back former Grizzly Shane Battier. And with the steady improvement in all their young players, this would be enough for them to make another playoff appearance in the 2011 season. The Grizzlies would make this run late in the season without their second leading scorer Rudy Gay, who was out due to a shoulder injury. The Grizzlies advanced into the playoffs as an 8th seed, going against an older San Antonio Spurs team, with Tony Parker taking over as their best player over Tim Duncan, as well as Manu Ginobili stepping up and even becoming an all-star in the 2011 season. The Grizzlies shocked the world as they were able to beat the first-seeded Spurs in 6 games, with a big series performance from Zach Randolph on the offensive end, as well as great defensive performances from Marc Gasol in the paint, as well as Tony Allen and Mike Conley on the perimeter. And this series upset would put the league on notice for the Grizzlies' suffocating defense, with them being called the grit and grind Memphis Grizzlies. In the second round, the Grizzlies faced a young upstart Oklahoma City team behind Kevin Durant, Russell Westbrook, and James Harden, and the Thunder would win in a hard-fought 7-game series where Durant and Westbrook would average 50 points together in that series. With 4 Grizzlies players averaging double digits throughout their run, they showed a lot of promise, as people thought if they had one of their top scorers in Rudy Gay, they could become one of the top teams in the West. But unfortunately, next season would be the lockout season for them, and they wouldn't have too much time to gain any more chemistry throughout the rotation due to Zach Randolph being out for half of the season. But the Grizzlies still made it to the playoffs, where they would lose in the first round to a Clippers team in 7 games. Going into the 2013 season, the biggest question was if the Memphis Grizzlies could be finals contenders, especially knowing Rudy Gay was back for a full season, and there was improved play of Randolph, Gasol, and Conley over the years. But the second thought was if the top 4 players can live up to the contracts, as Rudy Gay, Zach Randolph, Marc Gasol, and Mike Conley together was due up for most of the salary cap, and with new ownership came new expectations, and the new executives didn't have the same high hopes for playoff success that the Grizzlies players had. This first started in the 2012 offseason, where they would let go of OJ Mayo, where he would sign with the Mavericks. One reason was them not being able to afford OJ Mayo, but the fact that OJ Mayo wanted a bigger role, as he was only a 6th man at the time behind Tony Allen. Memphis still stayed consistent throughout that season and were still in contention in the regular season standings. But this wouldn't change the new executives' minds, as they would still go on to trade Rudy Gay to the Raptors in a 3-team trade for Tayshaun Prince and other assets. With this trade, the Grizzlies gained more cap flexibility, and Memphis wouldn't lose their stride overall, as they would win the next 27 of their last 37 games to finish the season with a 56-26 record, and most notably Marc Gasol winning the Defensive Player of the Year award. The Grizzlies went to the playoffs as a 5th seed and beat the Clippers in the first round in 6 games, playing stellar defense throughout the series, specifically on Blake Griffin, though Blake Griffin would be injured in games 5 and 6, but it was a good series overall for the Grizzlies. Then they would advance to the second round to face the Oklahoma City Thunder. This 60-win Thunder team would be without Russell Westbrook, as he was injured in the series before, and it would take Durant alone to carry an OKC team against one of the best defenses in the league in the Grizzlies. Though the Thunder won the first game, the Grizzlies would respond in winning the next 4, as they were too much for Durant, as this series win would lead the Grizzlies to their first ever conference finals appearance. The Grizzlies faced a familiar opponent in the San Antonio Spurs, who looked a lot different than the team that they faced 2 years ago. The Spurs team would prove to be too much for the Grizzlies, as Tony Parker would lead the way, averaging 24 and almost 10 assists per game, along with 2 steals. The Grizzlies on the other side would struggle offensively, essentially getting shut down by the Spurs defense, having one of the lowest offensive ratings in the playoffs since they had this core. They would get swept by the Spurs, really showing the difference between them and a championship level team. Now for the last 2 seasons, in 2014 they would have a 50-game win season, but because of the increasing level of talent throughout the West, they would only end up as a 7th seed and losing to a fully healthy OKC team. And in the 2015 season, it would be no different. With the Grizzlies improving to 55 wins, there were still too many contenders in the conference, and no matter how you looked at it, a run for Grizzlies in the playoffs would be very difficult despite them having a great defense. With a new powerhouse in the Warriors winning 67 games, as well as a Rockets team with James Harden leading the way, and recent 2014 NBA champion San Antonio Spurs tied with the Grizzlies in standings, this was going to be a difficult time for Memphis to really make a run. But there's a reason why they're the grit and grind Grizzlies, as in the first round against the Portland Trail Blazers, they would defeat them in 5 games, but their fortunes really changed as Mike Conley would get injured in the first round, leading to him missing half of the series in the first round, as well as the first game in the second round against the number 1 seeded Warriors, where the Warriors would win game 1, but later the Grizzlies would win the next 2 games, and with the Grizzlies having a series lead after 3 games, head coach Steve Kerr would make a few key changes. First, in having Andrew Bogut, their center guard Tony Allen. This made it really hard for the Grizzlies offensively, as it was harder for Gasol and Randolph to create any offense inside, as the Warriors ignored Tony Allen on the perimeter. So due to the Warriors' adjustments defensively and them not really slowing down on the offensive end, the Warriors were able to beat the Grizzlies in 6 games in the semifinals. So throughout the Grizzlies' first 20 years, they had some really good highs, but also some lows I can't ignore. Their first 6 seasons in Vancouver was horrible. They didn't really have a true number 1 player, and the rest of their roster not being as talented really caused attendance to fall, therefore moving the Vancouver Grizzlies later on to Memphis. And once they moved with an improved front office over time, they were able to make 8 playoff appearances in 14 years. So with that being said, I think they're just the middle of the pack, which is why I have to put them at a C. Alongside Vancouver, Toronto was the other Canadian city to have an NBA franchise. And in late 1993, a group that was led by Toronto businessman John Bitove, who became the CEO for the Raptors until 1997, would be awarded the franchise. And to go a little bit more into the history of Toronto basketball, it would actually start a lot earlier, as in 1946 would be the NBA's first ever game that took place in Toronto, as the Huskies hosted the New York Knickerbockers. But the Toronto Huskies would only play 1 season before disbanding due to low attendance. And now for the new Toronto team, a contest was held for the name, and the eventual winner would be the Raptors due to the popular movie Jurassic Park. With that, one of the first moves for the Raptors was making Hall of Famer and Pistons legend Isaiah Thomas executive vice president, as well as giving him a stake into the franchise for him to be a part owner. He would have a hand in picking the expansion roster that unfortunately wouldn't include their first selection, BJ Armstrong, who didn't report to the team, and he was later traded to the Golden State Warriors. This was made up for at the time drafting Damon Stoudemire with the 7th overall pick, later becoming Rookie of the Year, averaging 19 points and 9 assists per game. But Damon's efforts weren't enough, as the Raptors would only win 21 games in their first season. The Raptors would improve overall, getting the 2nd overall pick in the 1996 draft and selecting Marcus Camby with that pick, as well as improving the next season to 30 games, while Damon Stoudemire was improving himself, averaging 20 points a game. And in the 97 offseason, the Raptors would select Tracy McGrady out of high school with the 9th overall pick. And before the 97-98 season for the Raptors, it looked very promising for them to improve furthermore with a solid young core and veterans, but every part of that franchise would end up being horrendous. As the first go into the front office in Isaiah Thomas, with him making moves up into the 97-98 season, Isaiah wanted a bigger share in the Raptors, in particular becoming a majority owner, but after being denied, he would later sell his share in that very season, and he would soon be replaced by another GM. And with that, Isaiah Thomas's resignation would play a bigger part than the Raptors would realize, as soon after Damon Stoudemire would demand a trade with the Raptors, as they were playing really poorly up until that point in the season, where at one point they were on a 17-game losing streak very early into the season. And the second reasoning being Isaiah Thomas's resignation, as Damon Stoudemire and Isaiah Thomas had a good relationship at the time. The Raptors would soon grant Stoudemire's request, getting traded to the Portland Trail Blazers for Alvin Williams, who would end up being with the team for a number of years, and former All-Star Kenny Anderson, who would never suit up for the Raptors, but would get traded soon thereafter for Celtics' Chauncey Billups. And then the coach Darrell Walker would get fired mid-season, and the Raptors would soon hire Butch Carter. This move would ultimately help rookie Tracy McGrady, who at that point was barely playing, with Carter giving him the playing time and confidence to give McGrady an overall better work ethic to improve and morale, as he was only an 18-year-old in a different country. But other than that, the Raptors would finish 16-60 in the 98 season, going into the draft selecting the 4th overall pick Antoine Jamison, and then later trading for the 5th overall pick in Vince Carter, who were both teammates on North Carolina. And with this trade, the Raptors would have Vince Carter and Tracy McGrady on the same team, who were relatives, and funny enough, didn't even know that until a couple years before the draft. The start of Vince Carter's career in Toronto would be great, winning Rookie of the Year in the lockout-shortened season of '99, where the Raptors would make small improvements, increasing their win total, and make a big leap in the 2000 season where they would finish above 500, winning 45 games and making the playoffs for the first time. The Raptors went to the playoffs as a 6th seed and would face the New York Knicks, but unfortunately they would get swept in that series, where Vince Carter struggled shooting 30% from the field. The Raptors were set to be a really good up-and-coming team with Vince Carter and Tracy McGrady going into the 2000 offseason, but Tracy McGrady ended up leaving the Raptors to go to another recent expansion team in the Orlando Magic. This was due to him wanting to be a number one option, as well as him playing near his hometown in Florida. This was a big loss for the Raptors, knowing what Tracy McGrady would become for the Magic, but the Raptors still had a good core around Vince Carter, as he would turn into a superstar in the 2001 season, with Antonio Davis also becoming an all-star that same season. This would lead the Raptors into the playoffs again, as Vince Carter would average a career best 27 points a game with 5 rebounds, 1.5 steals, and a block, and also shooting 40% from 3, going into playoffs as a 5th seed facing a familiar opponent in the New York Knicks, the same team they lost to the season before. With the Raptors winning the series 3-2 in the first round to advance to the second, where they would face the Philadelphia 76ers behind reigning MVP Allen Iverson. In that series, Iverson and Carter battled throughout the series, with both of them having 50-point performances. And this matchup would later become one of the greatest duels between players in recent history. But eventually the Sixers won the series in 7 games, where Game 7 will come down to a final shot, with Vince Carter having a chance to win the game, but unfortunately he would miss the buzzer beater. This would be the peak for Vince Carter and the Raptors, as for the next few seasons they weren't able to replicate that, as Vince Carter from the 02 season onwards would be in and out of the lineup due to injuries. First in the 02 season, even though in the offseason they would gain an almost retired Hakeem Olajuwon to try and help the Raptors contend, but he was just a shell of his former self at this point, and though he showed short flashes in that time, he could only ever be a role player for the Raptors in his one season. Carter ended up missing the second half of the season due to injury, but the Raptors would make a run in that time with players like Chris Childs, Morris Peterson, and Antonio Davis picking up the slack, with no one truly being the number one option. But somehow this brand of basketball worked out for the Raptors, making them more dangerous, and heading into the playoffs they would finish as a 7th seed facing the 2nd seeded Detroit Pistons. And the Raptors would put up a good fight for a 7th seed, as they would go all the way to Game 5, where they would lose 3-2 in the first round. The 03 season will start the decline of the Raptors, as they would hit their worst mark in the 2000s so far, only winning 24 games and missing the playoffs. Vince Carter only played half the season and struggled, and then in the offseason the Raptors would get the 4th overall pick, selecting Chris Bosh out of Georgia Tech. And continuing into the 04 season, the Raptors had a lot to make up for, with a healthy Vince Carter now in the lineup, but with veterans aging and the Raptors front office failing to get a solid team around Carter, it really made it difficult for the team to win. They did, however, try to make moves, trading for starters Jalen Rose and Donyell Marshall to help the roster, and they still had an opportunity to make the playoffs, as they would head into the All-Star break with a 25-25 record. But the team would fall off completely, losing 24 of their next 32 games in the second half of the season to miss the playoffs entirely. Now in the 05 season, Vince Carter was fed up at this point with the front office's moves, failing to build a proper roster around him with failed signings, draft picks not reaching their potentials, with only second-year Chris Bosh and an old first-round pick in Mo Pete being the only decent draft picks they'd had in the past 5 years, as well as their most recent pick, Rafael Arujo, in the 04 draft, being a bust very quickly in that 05 season. Vince Carter requested a trade early into the 05 season, and he would get his request granted, as he would get traded to the New Jersey Nets for Alonzo Mourning, who would eventually be waived by the team and never play a game, as well as getting Eric and Aaron Williams, 2 first-round picks. But this would be one of the worst trades for the Raptors and probably in NBA history, as the Raptors essentially got no value and current talent for Vince Carter, with even the 2 first-round picks I mentioned earlier only being career bench players. This started a rebuild for the Raptors as they would only win 33 games in the 05 season, later drafting Charlie Villanueva out of Connecticut with the 7th pick. In this rebuild, they had some hope with Chris Bosh leading the charge, as in the 06 season without Vince Carter, Chris Bosh's averages would jump to 22 and 9 respectively, quickly putting Bosh in the same position as Vince Carter years before, as the team would have a rough time acquiring talent around the new star, leading a team with very little talent around him. The Raptors would finish 27-55 in the 06 season and then hire GM Brian Colangelo, who was previously the NBA Executive of the Year for the Phoenix Suns. Later in that 06 offseason, the Raptors won the lottery, securing the first pick, where Colangelo's biggest decision was selecting Andrea Bargnani from Italy. And then the 2007 season, the Raptors would have a little bit of a new look, trading their 2005 first-round pick Charlie Villanueva for starting point guard TJ Ford, as well as signing pro journeyman Anthony Parker, who would also start for the Raptors. And they would improve over the next 2 seasons, winning 47 games in 2007 and getting the 3rd seed, making the playoffs behind Chris Bosh, TJ Ford, and Anthony Parker leading the way, with Andrea Bargnani contributing from the bench. And with this recent success, GM Brian Colangelo won the Executive of the Year award with the Raptors, along with Sam Mitchell winning Coach of the Year. But later in the playoffs, they would lose 4-2 to the New Jersey Nets, facing a former Raptor in Vince Carter, and in 2008, the Raptors would head back into the playoffs with a 41-41 record, kind of showing how weak the East was at the time, but they would still make it as a 6th seed, losing in the first round against the Dwight Howard-led Orlando Magic. In the 2008 offseason, the Raptors traded for former All-Star power forward Jermaine O'Neal, in a trade that would send starters TJ Ford and Rajo Nesterovic to the Pacers, as well as first-round pick Roy Hibbert, who they recently drafted in the 2008 draft. Jermaine O'Neal started in the front court alongside Chris Bosh, as well as backup point guard Jose Calderon becoming the permanent starter replacing TJ Ford. But the Raptors were worse off with these changes, as they started the season 8-9 before firing Sam Mitchell, making assistant coach Jay Triano the interim head coach. And it would only get worse from there, as they would go 25-40 for the rest of the season with Jay Triano as the head coach, as well as Jermaine O'Neal struggling throughout, with him then being traded at the trade deadline for Sean Marion and a couple of other assets. So essentially within the season, Brian Colangelo traded the Raptors starting point guard as well as Roy Hibbert, who was a very serviceable big man in the early 2010s, becoming a 2-time All-Star for essentially nothing. So the Raptors' future really looked grim, with lackluster trades and signing throughout that time from 05 to 2009 that honestly I could have mentioned to you, but I promise you wouldn't know any of the names to begin with. With that and the continued failure to develop anyone in the draft, with former number 1 pick Bargnani not living up to expectations, among others, this was a very hard situation for a star like Bosh to feel optimistic for. And going into 09 offseason, the Raptors had the 9th pick selecting DeMar DeRozan, and most notably signing Hedo Turkoglu that just came off a 2009's finals run with the Magic. And this gave the Raptors the opportunity to space the floor as well as get a secondary ball handler on the court with Jose Calderon. With all of that, the season started well for the Raptors, as they would be the 5th seed by the All-Star break in the 2010 season. Yet the Raptors would have another meltdown after finishing the season without making the playoffs, placing 9th in the East. And this would be the last season for Chris Bosh, as in his first 7 seasons with the team, having never won a playoff series and only winning 9 playoff games total in his Raptor tenure, compared to his counterparts in the 03 draft in LeBron, Dwayne Wade, and Carmelo Anthony, all at least making it to the conference finals. Bosh would end up joining the Miami Heat with Wade and James in the 2010 offseason. Hedo Turkoglu soon left after via trade, and he demanded the trade due to his frustrations with the front office and the Raptors' lack of an offensive system in his lone season with the Raptors, averaging lows in points, rebounds, and assists compared to his time in Orlando. Now with another star player leaving, another rebuild started under an unproven player in DeMar DeRozan that didn't show a lot in his rookie year and was still a raw prospect at the time. as the Raptors overall were stagnant over the next few seasons, which included a 22-60 record the very next season in 2011, with Andrea Bargnani showing some bright spots as to why he was chosen first in the 06 draft, averaging 21 points per game, as well as DeMar DeRozan improving to 17 points a game. After the 2011 season, this was the second year in a row where the Raptors ranked last in defensive efficiency. Soon after, head coach Jay Triano was fired, with Brian Colangelo saying he wanted a different voice in the locker room, and that would come in the form of hiring Dwayne Casey, who was an assistant for the NBA champion Dallas Mavericks the season before. And although the Raptors' defense improved that next season, the team still continued to struggle overall, finishing 11th in the East in the 2012 lockout season. But Toronto would still continue to struggle, finishing 11th in the East in the 2012 lockout season. And the Raptors made a couple moves in the 2012 offseason that included signing Landry Fields and acquiring point guard Kyle Lowry via trade to start over Jose Calderon, as well as just before the season signing DeMar DeRozan to a multi-year extension. The Raptors continued to struggle in the 2013 season as Andrea Bargnani's stats were starting to dip, as well as DeMar DeRozan's stats kinda stagnating, and there were questions at the point guard position, with Kyle Lowry getting benched for Raptors veteran Jose Calderon due to injuries and inconsistent play on Kyle Lowry's part. So in an attempt for the Raptors to improve, they would make a trade acquiring Rudy Gay, and that would send longtime Raptor Jose Calderon and Raptors 2010 first round pick Ed Davis to the Memphis Grizzlies, and Rudy Gay came in immediately and made an impact, beating the Los Angeles Clippers by 25 in his first game, but his play didn't really translate to winning basketball as the Raptors would still finish the season 34-48 in 2013. And in that 2013 offseason, Brian Colangelo would be dismissed as the GM and president, later bringing in another former NBA Executive of the Year, who was previously the Raptors' assistant GM years ago in Masai Ujiri. And Masai's first move was getting rid of Andrea Bargnani's contract, where he was quickly declining as he would get traded to the New York Knicks for contract fillers as well as future picks. After a slow start to the 2014 season, the Raptors and Masai wanted a change, and they would make a big one, trading Rudy Gay to the Sacramento Kings for Grievous Vasquez, Patrick Patterson, John Salmons, and Chuck Hayes, basically setting up a rebuild. But this deal ended up being an addition by subtraction move for the Raptors, as trading Rudy Gay freed up space for DeMar, as he would have a great season, increasing his averages, as well as Kyle Lowry at the starting point guard position. And this would make them into a very good duo for the team, as this was something the Raptors haven't seen before, and the Raptors would win 48 games and make the playoffs, finishing as the third seed in the East. The Raptors would face the 6th-seeded Brooklyn Nets, who was a very solid team on paper, and it would be a hard-fought series as DeMar DeRozan and Kyle Lowry would have solid performances, but it wouldn't be good enough as the Nets would win in 7 games. And the Raptors would continue their momentum going into the 2015 season, where they would improve their win total by only 1, but this would be their highest mark as a franchise so far, with 49 wins. Highlighted by Kyle Lowry getting his first All-Star nod, as well as new acquisition Lou Williams winning his first Sixth Man of the Year award, the Raptors would enter the playoffs as a 4th seed facing the 5th-seeded Washington Wizards. But this playoff run was short-lived as the Raptors got swept by the Washington Wizards 4-0, with most of the Raptors struggling in that series, with DeMar DeRozan only averaging 20 points, as well as Kyle Lowry shooting only 30% from the field and 20% from 3, averaging only 12 points and 4 assists in that series. Overall, the Raptors had a tough time acquiring quality players or assets over the 20-year span, with most Raptors teams featuring only one star with very little support, which only changed until the end of their run to find a surprising duo in DeRozan and Lowry. The 7 playoff appearances over that span with 3 vastly different teams showed that the Raptors could make the best out of what they had, though the few bright spots in those seasons still didn't outweigh the bad moves from the front office overall in those 20 years, so I'm gonna have to put the Raptors in D tier. So with that, I finished all the rankings of the expansion teams since the merger. Do you think a certain team's ranking is too high or too low? Let me know in the comments below. So please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I'm out.